first category of question is about belief in theology. What's the most compelling reason that you believe in God?
This is a kind of strange question for me, because I have a profound belief in the reality and existence of God, but it's not based on reasons. It's based on faith. And what I mean was, before I became a Christian in my early 20s, I was a secular agnostic, very much centered on the dunya. And then one day I said I became a Christian in my local Baptist church. And from that moment onwards, literally, I know it's cliche Christian thing to say, but I had a profound belief in God, and it came to me as a gift, and it was just there. One moment I didn't have it, I had vague notions, but the next minute it was an epistemological and metaphysical certainty, and that's never left me. And so this is something I'm grateful in my Christian journey for having received this gift from God. So it was never based on reasons. I do think there are excellent reasons for believing in God, but that's not why I believe in God.
Interesting.
And I think Islamically, we see this in the writings of Ibn Taymiyyah, for example, the idea of the fitra. It is actually a part of our DNA as our species, is actually to, I don't mean literal DNA, but metaphorical DNA, to believe in the transcendent God and to believe in right and wrong, and the sense of our being in life is to follow God. So I think that was maybe activated or reinvigorated or vitalized in my Christian experience at that point.
Interesting. So would you describe it, because as you well know, there's a lot of conversations within Christian theology and also Islamic theology that would try to place this within a larger debate as to how these things happen. Would you say that the faith for you was an act of grace or an act of providence, that it was a gift that was given to you? Is there fideism a little bit a part of this, like that faith is not necessarily a conviction that is based on rational proofs, but rather an exercise of a moral virtue or something of this nature? Where do you feel like your own personal experience maps onto these sort of classical debates as to what is faith?
I would never say my experience mapped onto anything so august as these great debates. I think I had a profound sense when I became a Christian of entering into a moral universe. Whereas before I didn't really have any clear moral compass, but I accepted an absolute moral system. And at the heart of that was the sense of a glorious and transcendent God. It was quite a Calvinist understanding, I think, at that time as an evangelical, which I was. And so there's a lot of good in Christianity, and I think I want to stress this. Our differences of Christianity, I think, are of important matters, but most of it, belief in God, belief in the prophets, belief in angels, the afterlife, the resurrection of the dead, and so on and so on, we do share this. And so I've kept most of my beliefs there. But but for me, it was a spiritual transformation. It was a profound cognitive change. And that has matured and developed and been refined in my later embracing of Islam. Islam wasn't a complete revolution, it was a fulfillment, a development, rather than a completely new thing.
I find that very profound, because sometimes when people who aren't converts, when they talk to converts, they might have very simplistic notions of what it looks like to convert. And I have heard people say, wow, it must be so incredible to have every single thing that was just wrong in your life. And now, it's like complete darkness, complete light. And there are situations that people live in such stark binary experience of life. But for many people, I mean, the words that you've used, refinement, I think is very, very rich, right? Like, it's actually, there are some meta skills, there are virtues, there are positive things that are there, and yet Islam is a refinement of those things. And I think even if you look at the way in which Islam came to the Quraysh, or came at the time of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, I don't think many people would be able to put together the argument that it was a complete revolution in every single way that society was based off of. The society had virtues, there was generosity, there was some sort of sense of duty, even though there were other things that were horrible that were going on. And so Islam acted as a refinement or a filter of sorts. What do you think, to move on to another question, what's one thing that you feel people misunderstand about Tawheed?
That's a really interesting question. And I think for many people in the West, maybe it's more widespread than that, at the back of their minds, if they're not already committed Muslims, for example, that when they hear language about God and God's existence, they might think at the back of their mind that God is an object in the universe. So, we have the universe and we have God in the universe, sometimes very crudely depicted, like an old man in the sky. We see this in many churches.
Oh, yeah.
Interesting, actually. God, it's quite appalling, anthropomorphic depictions of God as a male, usually white figure with long hair and a beard of a certain age. and so this, I think, a misunderstanding about Islamic Tawhid would be that Muslims simply have an Arabic sounding version of that. Now, that's absolutely not the case. And indeed, in many elements of the Christian tradition, that's not the case. I think you have Thomas Aquinas, for example, where God is not part of the universe at all. He is the cause, the ground, the reason for the existence of existence. Existence as such is a creation of God who transcends our categories. And so real Islamic monotheism, the Islam of the Quran, is extraordinary and revolutionary in that sense. It smashes these man-made idols, these paradigms of God being a man or God being an object in the universe, that he is beyond our conception, he is beyond our thinking. And so I think that's the misunderstanding that people have. They don't really have a correct understanding of Tawhid at all. But the Quran is very clear on that.
I'd like to ask a corollary that's off script here, but I think it's relevant, especially with dialogue between Christianity and Islam, or Christians and Muslims. Many Christian apologists accuse Islam, the Quran, and Muslims of strawmanning Christian theology. It's hard to pin down one Christian theology. Obviously, there are many sects, and those schisms have profound. There's variety, let's just say, in Christology or theology between Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic or Protestant or others. How would you respond to that? How would you respond to someone who's saying that the author, we'll put on the hat and imagine that we're Christian apologists, the author of the Quran doesn't properly understand Christian theology, and so the refutation that's found therein is not accurate?
I sometimes hear that, but I don't think that is accurate. I think the Quran has a very nuanced understanding of Christian doctrine. I think the mistake is that Christians think that the Quran is a theology textbook of Christian theology. So it's there to correctly define the Council of Nicaea or Chalcedon or Constantinople. It's not like that. It can be polemical. It's trying to wake people up to true belief. So some of the statements in the Quran are not intended to be, as I say, academic treatise on Christian theology, trying to represent how they see things. No, it's trying to, as I say, wake people up or criticize or subvert these categories, which are clearly mistaken. So I think they misunderstand what the Quran is about. But I think sometimes we misrepresent Christianity as well. For example, the way some, and I'm not obviously not going to mention names, but sometimes the way the Apostle Paul, as he's known, is spoken of amongst Muslims is completely misrepresent him. So the idea, for example, that Paul abolished the law, the Jewish law. Now you can argue that if you want. There are passages like Ephesians 2:15 which sound like that. But then the allegation is made that Paul is antinomian. Antinomian, the technical word meaning that he has no moral code and that you can basically do what you like. It's kind of a libertinism. You can be promiscuous, whatever, because as long as you have belief and faith in Christ, you're going to go to heaven. So you don't need to follow any moral code. And I've heard people say it's completely wrong. Because although Paul's relationship with the Jewish law is complicated and arguably he doesn't have a central place in the Jewish law at all in his salvation theory, nevertheless, he is profoundly moral in that if you look at the end of his letters, he's always exhorting people to righteousness and to live godly lives and to flee from immorality and sin. So that's not antinomianism. It's a kind of non-Jewish law pietism. I don't know how to describe it, but that's a misrepresentation of Paul. But I think what Paul did in his polemics against the Jewish law, particularly in his letter to Galatians, is profoundly problematic and has left the Christian world without a public role for divine law. because it basically sidelines it completely. And so his legacy has defined the West, actually, in a very important way, in its individualism and its secularism. He didn't intend that, but I think it's an unintended consequence of his theology, is to rob us of a sense of the place of law, Sharia, halakha, in the Jewish sense, in the public domain. And so the forces of secularism have taken over in this vacuum. And I think that Paul could do that because he thought the world was not going to be around for very long.
Sure.
And so he didn't really see an issue.
Those types of nuances are very important, and it doesn't do anyone any favors to caricaturize and to oversimplify. You know, I think that many people, they want to reach for a scapegoat, and Paul is certainly the most convenient and ready-made scapegoat for what went wrong with Christianity. But it is always more complicated than that. And so that makes a lot of sense. I tend to think of the history of thought as moving like a glacier, right? That it has a glacial dimension to how it moves, and that it is slow, it is hard to steer, but you know, the pathways that are chosen, or the pathways that things move in, create opportunities that are, some are foreseen, some are unforeseen, and then it forecloses other opportunities. So that's very, very interesting. Okay, turning to culture and modernity and how one can be religious in today's milieu. What's one modern trend or phenomenon that you think that Islam warns us about?
That's a good question. I don't really have any interesting answers to that. I think the profoundest, something that actually Solzhenitsyn, the Russian thinker, also pointed to, and that is the West's godlessness. The West has forgotten God. And this is no trivial observation. Our civilization in the past, in America and Britain and so on, at least pretended to be theocentric, even if it wasn't always in practice. There was an attempt to give a sense of a direction towards God in all that we did, in our morality, in our lives, in our policy, in our everything. And that has gone now, I think, or maybe it's been revived in America. I don't know. With you can speak to that, but usually it's not been there now. And so Islam is a call back to belief in the Creator of the heavens and the earth in a very pure way. And so the message of Islam couldn't be more timely, actually, for the West. And it is ultimately the solution to the West's existential and social crisis.
It's a very interesting solution, too, and a very interesting call, because most of, and I'll speak from the American context here, most of the attempts to militate against this phenomenon of godlessness, which you so well articulated, they come from a sense of conservatism and going back.
Yes.
And usually they're rooted in a very highly idealistic sense of Western civilization, one that's quite simplistic, one that maybe never really actually existed, or maybe it did exist but was simultaneously coeval with lots of other negative things, right? This, again, sort of sidesteps the historical problem that you bring up with a figure like Paul, where interventions are made, and that creates the possibilities that now those possibilities are unfolding. So my reflection often on the conservatives and the conservative Christians in the U.S. space is, you know, if you imagine going back to a more idealized past, what sort of intervention is to be made that wouldn't simply just continue to follow the same opportunities or openings or trajectory that was already trod to go down this path of godlessness?
Yeah.
And perhaps the answer is not simply in trying to beckon towards our nostalgia. And I use "our" there tongue in cheek, because there's a lot of important discussions as to who is the us in that. Okay. But perhaps that the better solution, right, is a solution from an unexpected place. Yeah. Right. And I think that Islam offers that call. Now, you've got certain people who are maybe more open to hearing that possibility, and other people for whom they gloss Islam as just part of the diversity parade of leftist identities, and therefore, nope, absolutely not. Or there's others that have fallen to anti-Islamic propaganda, that it's some just political ideology that's here to cut your heads off or whatever. There's various different types. But I think that, again, speaking to the American context, I think that people who are conservatives who yearn for a more thickly religious society and life, I think they owe it to themselves to consider the invitation of Islam.